So thank you for joining us today for our Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. This is the second part of a two-part series. The focus of this institute is on supporting those individuals experiencing grief and loss during COVID-19 and beyond. And we're very glad you're here with us today. My name is Erin Briley, and I am the technical trainer for the Mountain Plains Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I am pleased to be your host for this conference session, and I'm pleased to introduce this session entitled Building Virtual Communities to Support Grieving Youth and Families During Uncertain Times. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for being here with us today, and a big thanks to all of you for joining us, and we truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful for your work. Next slide, please. We want to recognize that participating in this and our other sessions may activate your own grief and feelings of loss. As mental health care professionals or providers, we also need to care for ourselves, so please monitor yourself and practice good care, including taking breaks, stretching, drinking plenty of fluids, and practicing mindfulness or whatever helps you in staying centered and grounded. If needed, we do have some links to helplines and hotlines available. Also listed our Learning Institute website. So if we could post that in the chat box, Stephanie. Our next slide, please. Oh, there it is right there. Our SAMHSA-funded MHTTC network focuses on technology transfer, which means adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the U.S. states and territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Next slide, please. And here we have our map. And this map displays the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers and a Native American Indian and Alaska Native Center, as well as a National Hispanic and Latino Center and a network coordinating office. I personally work at the Mountain Plains Center, or it's one of the projects that I work with. But please visit our website and find the centers or your center so you can stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your area. Next slide, please. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide, please. All right, so it looks like we're ready to get started. I want to thank Lauren, and if you could go to the next slide, Talya. I just want to thank Lauren Schneider and Talya Schlesinger. I'm so proud of myself for being able to say that. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you at this time.
Okay, thank you, Erin, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. I wish that we could see you the way you can see us. It would make this a lot more fun. But since we can't, we will ask you if you could put in the chat a little bit about yourselves. That would be helpful for us. You can tell us what kind of setting you work in, if you're a school-based therapist, or if you work in an agency setting, or if you work specifically in a grief support setting, you could let us know that. And we're also very curious if you're joining us for the first time or not. But I'll tell you a little bit about who we are while you're working on that. I'm Lauren Schneider. I'm the clinical director of the children's programs at Our House Grief Support Center, and we're a nonprofit, non-sectarian grief support center serving Los Angeles County. And I turn it over to you, Talya, to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Talya Schlesinger. I was just peeking at the chat box while Lauren was talking. Thank you so much for sharing about yourselves. It's helpful for us as we continue. So along with Lauren, I work at Our House Grief Support Center as one of the associate clinical coordinators of our Camp Erin, and our children's in-house program, grief support groups.
And we're noticing you're from all over the country, and the world. So we're really glad to be with you today. And We are going to be talking about 3 different programs that make up our child and adolescent program. We work in a school-based setting, we do a camp setting, and then we also work within our agency and our office setting. So that's more like a social service type setting. So it might be applicable in different ways, just like you come from different types of settings. But so it's Friday, and everybody hopefully are breathing a little bit of a sigh of relief. We made it through another stressful week together. And just to start us off, let's go to the next slide, Talya. I want to tell you a little bit about how we are being impacted at this point, because it's different than during the first time we presented by death and by COVID. Children are impacted by death according to the Childhood Bereavement Estimation Model, which is a model that calculates for every state in the United States. Judy's House and the JAG Institute in Colorado comes up with a number for each state and a national number. The statistic of the number of kids who will impacted by a death of a parent or sibling is 1 in 14 by the time they graduate high school. That's the national number. In California, it's 1 in 18 for those of you that are Californians like us. So that number is going up nationally and in California. COVID is impacting us as Americans now. We were at 1.7 million at the time of the first part 1 of this institute. Now we're at 240, not million, I'm sorry, 170,000 Americans having died. Today we're at 243,000 Americans. Now, that will impact for every 1 death, 9 people will be grieving. So that makes 2.2 million grievers due to COVID right now in our country. So that's a lot of people needing our support, and hopefully we'll give you some tools today to make you feel more, more equipped when you go back to your offices on Monday to support the grievers in your own settings. Okay, so let's move forward.
So to start, before we get into more of our content, we just want to establish some common definitions around what grief is and when we say grief, what we mean. And our number 1 here, thoughts and feelings and behaviors that someone feels after someone close to them has died, is exactly how we would share that with kids and teens that we work with. So when we use the word grief with our kids that come into our program, we ask them what they think grief means and share this definition with them. Of course, all of us on the call have our own experience one way or another with grief, and that may play into how you think about grief and your perception of what the word grief means to you. And to add a whole layer onto that, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and the feelings of loss associated with the pandemic have increased, tremendously over time, and our kids and teens that we work with are feeling that as well. And we also want to include the grief that is manifesting as a result of the racial and social injustice happening all across the world and the US. And that layer of grief is felt tremendously as well. So when we talk about grief, we're mainly talking in this presentation about our first point here, the feelings associated after someone dies, but they are so interconnected to the other feelings of grief and loss that is happening today that's important to mention. So what to do when all of this grief is layered one on top of the other? Lauren mentioned this briefly at the start of the presentation, but our organization has 3 branches in which we serve children and teens. That's our school-based grief program, our in-house grief groups, and our Camp Erin LA program. And we'll get into each program as we go through the presentation. and hopefully share tangible takeaways for you all to either implement projects that you can with kids or big picture ideas of how to support grieving children during this time.
I see Jewel just put in the chat the loss of feeling of safety due to the social unrest, which Talya mentioned as well, but also the election has created a lot of feelings of loss, of feeling of safety, and this transition period that we're in. I don't know if anyone put that in the chat, but a lot of people are feeling that. So we found this powerful image, which we used last time, and we put it here because early in the school year or early in the pandemic, we found, as many of you probably did also, that that our ability to reach the children on our caseloads was really limited due to a lot of different factors, but the overwhelm of their parent due to the parent or guardian due to the pandemic was creating a lot of challenges, obstacles, barriers, whatever you call it in your setting, that was making it virtually impossible in some families. We lost a lot of our clients that were on our caseload prior to the pandemic, and then it was making it hard to do outreach to new potential clients in our schools and in our for camp, and to be able to provide those services. And then when the school year started, we knew that there were going to be a lot of those challenges as well because of the chaos and overwhelm of the spring semester, all the best efforts of the school systems to meet those challenges and be prepared in the fall. A lot of them were going to still exist in spite of all of the talent and dedication and commitment to making it better this school year. Okay, Talya. And I guess the last point I want to make about that slide is that all families with children are experiencing these challenges and in the settings you're serving. But when you're a grieving family, you have to add another factor, that they, at the same time, they're also consumed with this longing for their person who died, and this belief that things would be so much better if only that person were here with them. And that was what we were hearing so much from the children, is that if that person were here, they would be having more fun, or they would be feeling safer. And that was consistent across the ages of people we were working with and in each of the programs. Okay, so what we wanted to do for this session was do a little bit of a deeper dive into how we actually did work with people, how we are working with them in spite of these challenges. Okay, Talya.
So to start, we'll share a little bit more about our camp Erin. Camp Erin LA is part of a network of bereavement camps through the Aluna network, one of the largest bereavement camp network, although I don't think that there are many networks that we're competing with for that specific type of camp, but it is a large network of camps that provides grief support for kids as young as 6 all the way through high school, 18 or 19 if they're still in high school. And the goal of our camp is really to normalize feelings of grief for these kids and teens, to create connection and community for them, and for them to feel not so alone in their feelings of grief. And we started, we talked about this a little bit in the first session, that there was so much unknown in the beginning of the pandemic about whether we could have camp or not. And we love having this photo as our representation of camp, which was taken at our camp when we were able to have in-person camp a few years ago. And it reminds us, what does a grieving child look like? What do you think someone who's a teen that's grieving looks like? And oftentimes we see smiling faces in the pool. And that is a lot of joy that kids can connect and share that special bond, and not just be the grieving child. But at camp, they are just a camper, just like anyone else. And we wanted to start our camp session with this photo, also to just bring a little hope that one time in the future, we'll be back together in the swimming pool. But until then, we have some ideas of how to make those connections online. And that's what we'll talk a little bit more about today. So we were sad when we had to cancel camp, and this image helps capture that. Camp is a very special place for kids and teens to connect and bond, and particularly grieving children have a space where they aren't in the confines of the stress of the family. So oftentimes, especially teens, take on adult roles after a parent has died. And when they're home, they feel that responsibility in a very different way. And particularly in the pandemic, that has only increased. And camp gives them a place just to be kids again. So a quick recap of what we had to do to make our camp work online, and then diving in a little bit into how that could translate into some of your programs or ways you're working with kids and teens. So we typically have 2 sessions of camp, a June and an August session. And we entirely canceled June and invited all of those campers to our virtual August camp, which was just a 1-day session, a couple hours in the morning. And I'll tell you what that looked like in just a minute. The other huge component of our camp are our volunteers, who are wonderful and trained by us and usually come year after year and really are dedicated to the program. And they too were feeling the loss of camp. So we really had to set a space. We had a summit via Zoom for them to also express their feelings of grief and loss for not being able to come to camp, which is such a beautiful thing for them and really fuels them often for the year. So it was a good reminder to us that while we were in the midst of feeling stressed of what to do next, our volunteers needed that support as well. And then the big one was redesigning our program to still meet our needs. And what would that look like via Zoom to engage campers and train fewer volunteers, but still have some there to help support our kids. So here's a little peek into what our camp box looked like. There was also a camp t-shirt and a couple other very campy things, but we did send a camp in a box to all of our campers, which had everything they needed. It felt really important to us to really equalize, right? Whatever anyone had at home, didn't matter for the camp day, we will hand you everything you need for our session. And that's worked really well for our other programs. After camp, we adopted the Camp in a Box to meet other needs in our programs. And I would recommend that to anyone on the call who's thinking about putting together a virtual program, big or small. Being able to have a package arrive at the home felt really good to our kids and really exciting. On the side of the screen here, we have our outline for the day. It's quite pared down, but we wanted to share a little bit of the formula, so to speak, of how a virtual program around grief support could look. And for us, we started with our typical check-in, which helps the kids really start building their narrative around their name, their age, who died in their family, when that happened, and how that person died. To just begin sharing the narrative with their peers and hearing other stories in their cabin that might feel similar to theirs or connections they can make. And from there, it was really important that we had a rapport building activity. So for us, we used an M&M game where we sent little treats home to start building community. And that activity was not grief related. And for us, it's really important across our programs to keep that balance. And at camp, it's actually a 1-to-1 ratio. We do a fun activity and then a grief activity, a fun activity, and a grief activity. And virtually, we couldn't do that the same, but we recommend still having some balance with pure fun to make the grief activities not the entirety of the program, And in reality, they become more successful when you allow space for kids just to be kids and then jump into the grief activities. From there, we did a virtual grief hike where we sent home, on the screen here, we see little rocks. That was just an example. We send home feeling words on rocks, and that creates a virtual experience for them to sort of go on a little scavenger hunt, find their rock, share with their cabin, and learn coping skills along the way. And lastly, I'll just share a little bit about our luminary ceremony, which is a lantern ceremony that we do each year at camp. And we sent home a lantern for them to create in honor of their person who died. And one thing we want you all to take away from this is that there are still many, many ways for them to honor their person who died at home while still feeling part of a bigger community. And that was our biggest sort of takeaway in creating virtual experiences for our kids, is that dual experience of still being in the home, but connected to a larger community. School. Lauren, I'll hand it off.
Okay, before we do that, go to the next section. Let's see if anybody has a question for Talya about the camp experience.
Yeah, one question did come in, and we have a participant asking if there is a list of all the projects and everything you put into the box that you can share.
We have a list of the materials that we can definitely share afterwards. We have 2 boxes now that we've created as an organization. One is specifically for camp, and one is now for our ongoing in-house grief support groups. And we've actually also adapted something for our school program as well. So we can put together a list of materials that we can share at the end.
Great, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure, thanks, Erin.
Okay, all right, thanks for the question. So now we'll talk about the school-based program. This program's been in existence for more than 20 years actually, in a number of the districts in the county. So we have very deep relationships with the schools, with MOUs in place, and we anticipated that there would be a desire for schools to do the school-based group, but that the number of requests would be less than typical. And knowing that we didn't onboard as many new volunteers as we typically would in the fall. And that was partly because we wanted to ensure that we could provide an experience for our current volunteers to keep them engaged. So as a volunteer organization, it's important to keep your volunteers engaged and not lose them, because they're very valuable resources to us. Another thing we anticipated was that where typically our volunteer who goes into the school setting to do the group in person would not be able to be doing that because the groups were going to be online. We knew that that was going to be the case in Los Angeles. So we converted our curriculum to a virtual format, and we also created, well, with 2 options, that either the packet, which is usually developed 1 week at a time, that the children are given the program materials 1 week at a time, collected at the end of the session, and then the volunteers assemble all the children's work to create a memory book that they get on the last day. What we did instead was we compiled all the materials into like a booklet format, so that they would receive these at the start of the group instead. And that could be done either emailed to the schools to distribute to the children in person, or we would drop off packets for them, and the families could come and pick up a packet that would have, similar to that Camp in a Box, We had volunteers create packets with art supplies, the curriculum materials, journals, some snacks, some other little treats in these packets for schools that would say to us, okay, we'll take your packets and we'll invite the group members, grown-ups, to come to the school and pick up the program materials. So there were two ways that we established ahead of time that we would make these program materials available to the families, not knowing which way the school was going to go. So like what Maya Angelou said, we, in that quote, we prepared ourselves for the most positive outcome possible, not knowing, which way it was going to go, or even if it was going to go. And then what we encountered has actually been, it's actually been worse than we expected. We're doing about 25% the amount of groups this semester that we normally do, which is really, really, it's really sad, because that means that 75% of the grieving kids in the schools are not getting the services they need during a time when grief is spiking in our county, like in your counties as well, because of COVID. So at least if you're in a county like ours that is hit very, very hard, like in New York and in Texas and in a lot of your cities. So, but we're not giving up hope, and we have as many schools asking for groups as we thought we would. The problem is the schools have obstacles that we didn't anticipate. And make these new policies and obstacles within the school districts that we couldn't anticipate are making it harder for them to complete all their next necessary steps. So like to dot the I's and cross the T's on their part is making it harder for them to finally say, okay, we're ready, let's start group next week. And then our group leader can go on Zoom with the students and do the group. So, we're only doing as many as the schools can finally say we're good to go. And that's the best that we can do this year. And, we wish you that ability to do as many as you can do too. So what we wanted to share with you next slide is what the sessions actually look like. A little bit. Now, we don't usually do this in presentations, but we did want to give you some hands-on. So thank you for staying with us. The curriculum is usually a 10-week curriculum. We shortened it to 9 weeks because we know kids' Zoom attention span, especially grieving kids, their Zoom attention span is short. And so we made the curriculum a little tighter. Just going into it. This first session is about group bonding and creating safety in the room. Talya mentioned the M&M game, which we do at camp, which is basically once they've created group guidelines, which is our code word for group rules, we say guidelines so it doesn't sound so punitive, but that's about confidentiality and when we would need to break confidentiality to keep a child safe. We play a game where there are sentences that we throw out, some neutral things like, what's your favorite? What's the thing on the computer that kids like to do? Computer game, to play. And so they share, neutral things like that. But then we slowly get into grief-related topics like, was your person buried or cremated? Did you have a mom die or a brother die? And they start sharing that information. And every time they share, answer a question, they get to eat an M&M, which works well with the little kids. The older kids don't care about the candy. They just start sharing on their own. In fact, they're too embarrassed usually to eat in front of each other. So we do this game, and then they learn the opening rituals and the closing ritual for the program. The second session, we're also very slowly easing into the more the content that could trigger a grief or trauma response. And all of these children have been screened ahead of time to make sure they aren't going to get triggered into a major trauma reaction, since this is a support group, not a therapy group. So week 2, just quickly continue the bonding. And the activity that week, which we can do because they're at home, is very easy. Share an item from home that that helps you stay connected to your person who died. So that's about the continuing bonds, which is one of the most widely accepted dominant theories for grief, you know, in the Western culture. And so they'll share their item. When we're in person, we have them make a collage, and the group leaders bring magazines, clippings, and the kids select magazine clipping, but we can't do that online. So instead, they're bringing a photo or an item to share and talking about, you know, different things that they liked and that made their person special, like their hobbies, their favorite foods, the kind of music and TV and movies they liked, or pets, that kind of stuff. Week 3 is an activity again to, this one is actually, oh, and then we start teaching a coping strategy. So each week we'll teach them a coping strategy, many of which we've taken right out of trauma-focused CBT, out of that evidence-based practice. So while this isn't a therapy group, we're using techniques out of an evidence-based practices. So week 3, we're getting them used to using feeling words, which many of them are not accustomed to using. So we'll use the feeling faces charts. So they all have that in their packet. They select which of the feeling faces they relate to from the chart. And then they enter those feeling words which they have related to into a pie chart, like a diagram, which we'll show you a picture of in just a little bit. And so they're sort of mapping how their feelings of grief have been that day or since the last session. And then we go over a handout of what natural grief responses are. So there's a little psychoeducation. Week 4, now we're getting into a little bit more of that content that related to how their person died. And here we do ask them to draw the image that is in their mind about the death. So that might be the image that could trigger a flashback if they are experiencing flashbacks. And we want them to draw or write that image so that they're not alone with it anymore. And the coping strategy for that week is draw or write your happy place or safe place. And so they're also talking about or drawing that, and we're teaching them to imagine themselves in that place to self-regulate or comfort themselves when they need to. Week 5, we want to talk to kids both about what happens to the body after the death. So we'll ask them, was their person buried or cremated? Did you attend a funeral or memorial service for them? Those do look different, the ones that have happened during COVID. So we'll talk about what that was like. So they'll share their drawing or what they've written. and talk about that. And then the second part is, where do you think your person is now? So then those people who do believe in an afterlife will share about what their thoughts are about that. And if they've never thought about that or had that conversation in their family, we ask them, well, where would you like to imagine that your person is now? Because we're not telling them that there's an afterlife, because we're not teaching anything like a religion or what to believe. We're just saying, where would you like to imagine? If you could imagine them someplace, what would that be like? And that's a very comforting thing for them to do. Week 6, they do a mask project on a paper plate. Just do your how you look to the world, or on Zoom, on the outside, and then on the back of the mask, how you really look on the inside. So teach them, that sometimes the face we show to others is not the same as the face of how we really are on the inside. And then the second part is on a diagram of a body, draw a diagram where on your body you're feeling different feelings from that feeling faces chart again. And there we're introducing the idea that there's a mind-body connection between physical sensations and emotions. I know I'm going very fast, but if you do want to print out this the PowerPoint handout, you'll have this. Week 7. Now we know that one of the most common grief emotions is guilt. Or regret. So this one is to get at any feelings of guilt that have not also been talked about, and which it comes up quite often on the other weeks. But this one is a time travel activity. If you could go back in time and change something about your person's death, what would you change? What would you do differently if you could or could change something? So they do draw the time machine or write about going back and doing something over or differently, but they can't change that the person died. They can just change something about what happened, and that gives them an opportunity to express kind of thoughts that they might have done something or wish they could have done something that would have changed the outcome. Week 8 is something that we frequently do in therapy one-on-one with people, but they do as a group, a letter to their person who died. We have sentence starters for them to help structure it. And they also do a letter from the person who died to them, again with sentence starters for that. And that's very helpful for kids too. There's words in there like, I'm angry that, or I feel guilty when. So it's integrating feeling words into the letter. And again, mentioning there's a specific coping strategy that we're teaching at the end of each session that varies. And the last week, we do an activity called Connected for Life. I think we have a picture of that in this presentation. And in that one, we're promoting this idea of continuing bonds, that they are still connected and always will be, as long as they remember their person. So the ways they're connected, like an example would be, I still listen to the same kind of music, like to the Beatles, like I did with my dad when he was alive. So they talk about that, and then we have a beautiful goodbye ceremony with the kids. So that's how we're doing the school program, and it all works online. And it's something is better than nothing. If we can't do it in person, we can do it on Zoom. So let's see, do we have any questions about that before we talk about our in-house program? I know it was fast and a lot, so we have a lot to cover. Erin, any questions there? I see one Q&A.
Yes, actually, we do have two questions. One was if you were able to share your permission slips or consents that you have for the virtual group sessions. And that comes specifically from somebody working with a small Native American community in Arizona. And then the second question is, where do you get your curriculum? And if you produced a booklet or handbook with the curriculum for different age ranges, and they're interested in how to receive those or who to buy them from. So they're looking for some curriculum material.
The best thing to do for those questions would be just to email us, you know, or give us a call. So I think that our email address is was at the front of the presentation. You could just email me, Lauren at ourhouse-grief.org. We've designed the curriculum and most of the activities ourselves is the answer. And we'd be happy to share the permission slips, but we can't share the curriculum. It's copyrighted, and we have sold it along with training on how to set up a school curriculum before. So it includes like a whole training on that.
Thank you.
Oh, the email, Lauren at ourhouse-grief.org, and Talya's is Talya at ourhouse-grief.org.
I will put both of those emails in the question and answer box so everybody has those.
Thank you. Okay. Is this me still, Talya?
Yeah, go for it with Warden.
Okay, so one of the most widely accepted models on how to work with grievers has been for the last 30 years has been J. William Warden's task model. It's a non-linear model that describes tasks that grievers work on from the time of the death, really, until the time the griever dies, basically. And so you have the model on the left there. And then on the right, we have a treatment plan that we created for you to use for treatment planning purposes if you're in an agency where you have to write a treatment plan. So those correspond to each of the tasks. Okay. All right, so you could call them goals, like in treatment planning language. So we're going to go through this kind of quickly and then get to the description of some of the projects again. So just really quickly, the first goal is to help the kids not just accept that their person has died. So it's not just about accepting, but it's cognitively understanding what death means, how their person died, and what happened to their body after the death. Okay, and so all of that's going to depend on their stage of cognitive and emotional development and their life experience, if they've had a death before, and their age. And so, with infants, they're not going to have any language to understand what they're hearing in the house, but they will be very sensitive to changes in their caregiving environment, and they'll react to those changes the way babies do to anything that's going on in their caregiving environment. And they should be included in the family, in family discussions, because that's how they acquire language. And so they will eventually come to understand let's say it's a brother that died, they will eventually come to know about this brother. So they might as well start knowing about him as an infant that he lived. So I wouldn't shelter babies from anything, but let them be part of that conversation. Okay. Now with our toddlers, this slide says till 5 or 6. I thought, does it say 5 or 6 under there? Yeah. So we're talking about kids in the pre-operational stage according to Piaget, where their level of cognitive development makes it impossible for them to understand what death is. So they're basically struggling to make sense of the fact that the person that they care about is no longer present in a physical way in their life. And because they're magical thinkers, they are not able to think about this in a logical way and are probably thinking that something they said or did in a very egocentric way, something that they said or did caused the death. So this creates a lot of pain and guilt and confusion, and just an intolerable situation for our really young grievers. We have 4-year-olds in our program, and there's nothing we can say or do to change the fact that they don't understand that this person isn't coming back, or that death is permanent and irreversible until either their brain matures into the enough to get that death is permanent and irreversible, which doesn't happen until they get to the next stage of brain development, or enough time goes by. And that usually takes at least a year of doing something enough times without that person. So like a 4-year-old, when she gets to her 5th birthday and her mom or dad is still not there, then they might be like, oh yeah, this is my 2nd birthday now without my mom. I guess she's not coming back. And so, so what we want to do to support them is to, provide a lot of comfort and support and validating their feelings, and also, let's go on, Talya. And try and explain what has happened in a truthful but age-appropriate way. So we always explain death truthfully to kids, even in the very stigmatized type of deaths, deaths that people generally think are too harsh or, would be too hard for young ears to hear. So those might be like an overdose death or a suicide or a homicide. And, we'll talk about those really, really fast because those are harder for people to know how to explain. But we do always want to tell them the truth from the beginning, because we as the therapists don't want to collude with a family in telling a lie to a child, but instead we want to work with the family on why it's important to be truthful. So I would hope as a therapist that you would take that stance as well. Now, our next stage of development would be the operational stage according to Piaget. Now here, these kids, they do understand now that death is permanent. In other words, that their person is not, that once a person's body stops working, that's how it's going to be from now on. They're not coming back to life. That they're not alive somewhere else like their toddler siblings are thinking. But they they maybe are still holding hope that it was a mistake, especially if they didn't go to a viewing and see a body in a casket. They can't tolerate emotion for very long. They need to take breaks. They need to do several things in a session. And especially on Zoom, their capacity to stay focused in a Zoom session is very, very short. So they need to do standing things and sitting things and hear a story for a little, and and the biggest problem, especially for you school-based therapists, is that kids at this age especially don't know how to ask to get their emotional needs met. So what they do in order to let people know that they're in pain generally is that has been effective is what teachers call act out. The only way they've learned successfully in a lot of environments has been to do a negative behavior. So they'll do something in class that does get them noticed enough that, and then they get sent to the counselor's office or referred to the school social worker. And now we don't know how smoothly that process is going with people at home, if they are getting the opportunity to see the school social worker as much as if they could be sent with a little pink slip up to the office. So teachers need to understand that when a child does these behaviors that they call acting out or disruptive behaviors, that they're really just trying to let us know they're in pain. Okay, let's go on. Our pre-adolescent and teenagers are in the stage of formal operations. They're now capable to think about death in abstract terms like adults. They're asking questions like, why him? He was such a good person, or, she was so generous and kind to everybody. They are thinking that way now for the first time about their person who died. They understand death and fully, the way we do as adults, but they don't have the emotional capacity to withstand their strong emotions as well as adults are supposed to. And, of course, their brain development is not complete yet, and especially the connections between the emotional part of the brain and the learning centers is incomplete. So when there's been a lot of trauma, and a lot of our students in our schools here have experienced by high school several deaths, 3, 4 deaths of peers, cousins, family members, not just due to gun violence, but also due to healthcare problems because of poor access to quality healthcare. So these kids are very often in school in a heightened state of arousal because of all of this trauma that is accumulating for them. And so they're having trouble focusing, they're having trouble self-regulating, their judgment is impaired because of this, and they're coping with their grief in ways that can be very dangerous for themselves and sometimes even for other people. So these grievers are very at risk and need a lot of support. And, we're fortunate that we get to do a lot of high school groups and groups for high school aged and middle school aged students because they need that peer group as well at this age of similarly bereaved peers to identify with, so that they don't feel like they're the only ones that it's happening to. Let's go to the next slide. According to Erickson, that developmental imperative to have a peer group to identify with is like it's the thing for that age group. So they really have to have that peer group to identify with, of kids who understand what it feels like to experience a death. And the thing we hear, excuse me, the thing we hear from almost every teen that we meet, and Talya, you can verify this, is that they tell us that they're very disappointed by their friends, that people they thought with their friends really are not there for them anymore, and that they feel pretty abandoned by their friends by the time they get to us. And so when they join the group, they're looking to make new connections with other kids who are going to understand what they're going through and stick with them. Okay, so let's give you some tools for this, this first goal. We're going to talk about death, and we're going to use the D word. We're not going to use the euphemisms because it makes it more understandable across cultures. Because in different cultures, people use different euphemisms, and the child sitting across the table from you might not know the euphemism that you've grown up using. So just say died. They can take it. It's not going to hurt their ears. Okay, let's go on. We have to help kids tell their story. That telling their story, you're hearing this maybe in other workshops, it's such an essential part of our, just who we are as a species, that we are storytellers, and telling your story, the story of the death, is really important part of the grieving process. But it's hard for some kids, especially if the death was due to one of these more objectively traumatic kinds of deaths, like a suicide. And not only do kids have trouble understanding why their person did it, they have trouble just knowing how to talk about it, because sometimes the way the person ended their life is so painful that when they think about that, they get triggered into a trauma reaction. So if the child wants to talk about it and feels comfortable saying exactly how they did it, like he put a bag over his head and took a bottle of pills, then that's fine. But if they're having trouble, what we've learned from working with kids for all these years is you can offer them to just use the word died of suicide. Okay, that's the most simple way for a child to talk about it, is to just substitute that word, one word that just means when someone ends their own life. But they're coming up with their narrative based on what works for them, not to satisfy you or other people. It's what they feel comfortable saying, answering when people ask them, oh, what happened? What happened to your mom or dad? So remember, you can tell from their body language when you asked, can you tell me how your brother died? You can tell if they need help or not. Then we also want to see if they have an understanding of why it is that the person did that, if they were aware of the fact that that person may or may not have been suffering from an insight disease, which most often is a major depressive disorder or a major depressive episode. And then lastly, what they would do if they ever felt so depressed that they were thinking about ending their life, or were just really, really, really depressed. So making safety plans with kids. Okay, let's go on. The second one is homicide deaths. Sometimes those are hard for kids. They might get caught up in a really long story. Well, he was at the park and then he heard this noise and and all these people were there and they started shooting, you know, and then they get overwhelmed. But so if they're too overwhelmed, they can just say died from homicide, because that, again, that one word is more manageable for really young kids than to go into the story if they don't want to. Okay. Substance related deaths. First of all, they're hard because adults don't tell the kids that that's what the death was due to. They'll say it was a heart attack because that's what's on the death certificate. But kids know, like they know that the person had an addiction, or that they had a problem with drinking, or a problem with drugs, and they know that they had been in rehab. And so you can start talking to them about those things. And one of the ways we do it at our house, again, is to say that they were suffering from a disease on the inside, or an invisible disease. Kids call addiction, we call substance use disorder, but that's too much of a mouthful for kids. And then the language that they want to use, there's some suggestions that were things that kids have said. They're not suggestions. Too much medicine, or from drinking too much alcohol. Okay. And the COVID deaths are similar to what was going on when AIDS, before there were good medication treatments for the AIDS virus. Then there's going to be some tendency for people to blame a victim if they die from COVID. And we want to take away that stigma for the survivors in these families as well. They didn't do anything wrong. The problem is that they got this disease because there's no vaccine for it. And there isn't a good treatment for it available, widely available yet. So until we have a vaccine, people are going to be like, vulnerable to getting it. And it wasn't the person's fault that they got it. So we want to help the kids understand that that's why they got it, because there's no vaccine yet.
Lauren, should we check in with Aaron before we get to, I'm seeing some Q&A. Should we just check in with Aaron before we move to the next activities?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have about 4 questions. The first one is someone is wanting to have some examples of the ceremony and party that you were referring to at the beginning of this little session.
For the last day, we do what we call a sweet goodbye. It's there's where each child gets to say to the group what they're going to remember, miss, and a wish for the other children in the group. And there's also in some of the programs, not all of them, they get a rock, a smooth rock and a rough rock to represent the rough times that were happening when they started the program. And then the smooth is the healing that takes place as a result of being in the program. And then the wish is that there will be more smooth times in the future than rough times. So when the kids leave our in-house program, many of them will stay with us 2 years. So they get a pair of these rocks, and they get this ceremony when they leave where all the kids go around and say those 3 things: what I'll remember, miss, and my wish for you. And then they get a box with all their projects that we've been saving for them. So that's how we do our goodbye ceremony.
Very nice, thank you. Someone else was asking if there's a cost for the school program.
School program is offered free of charge to all the public schools.
Sorry, I'm multitasking here and trying to type simultaneously. And what activities do you do virtually with teens?
Okay, we're going to show you what some of these projects look like. Those slides are coming up.
Okay,
you want
any
to?
more questions?
Let's hear the last questions before we show those activities.
Okay, and I know you address this somewhat. How do you define suicide?
Suicide is when someone ends their own life. And like I said, it was an invisible disease usually that causes it. And that, so we'll say to the child, do you know whether your person sometimes was very, very depressed? And like maybe if they're really little kids, they may not know that word. That means that they didn't really feel very good, like they didn't feel like playing with you. And kids will usually say, oh yeah, that happened a lot. And older kids will say, yeah, he didn't stop wanting to go, skateboarding or play catch with me. And, they recognize what the signs of depression were. But some kids, they'll say, no, he was never depressed. He was always in the best mood. He was more fun than my mom. They'll say stuff like that. So the kids don't always know. And in that case, it could be like a major depressive episode that made the person feel so bad that they didn't want to live anymore. And then because that disease affects your brain, they can't think of anything to end that pain except ending their life. And so that's what they did.
Thank you.
I hope that helps. I'm trying to do this quickly because we have a little more territory to cover. Okay, should we go on then, Erin? Was that the last one?
Yes, that was the last one. Thank you.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, so activities. All right, so number one, you have some books that we feel are really great basic books to have handy. And then let's look at some projects. Okay, so we always ask kids to draw that image that they have of what happened when their person died. So not where they were, but what happened to their person at the time of their death. So this is a 7-year-old's drawing of their person hanging himself. We'll go on. This one is an 8-year-old or 8 or 9-year-old girl drew her father who had a heart attack. He was in the shower and came out and called for help. And that was the cause of death was heart attack. So we want them to share these images that are so painful that they carry around inside alone, so they're not alone with them anymore. Whether they witnessed or not, they can do these drawings. This little girl's dad was on a treadmill. Now, older kids will do, high school age kids will do these drawings too, or if they don't want to draw, they'll write it out on the paper. They'll fill up an entire sheet of paper, line by line, write out word by word what happened. Okay. Then what happened to their body, and draw a picture of, if you attended a funeral or a memorial service, and if they didn't go because it was in another country, we'll ask them to draw what they think happened. And then where do you think they are now? So this would be a child who had a concept of heaven in their family. This one, the story was, well, sometimes he's with God and sometimes he's with the devil. That was an 11-year-old. Okay, and then some challenges of doing this on Zoom, obviously. Well, sometimes they just don't show up because they're sick of being on Zoom all day from school. So we send out reminders every time before group, because we'll send out the link and the reminder every day before group. But and they'll RSVP, yes, I'm coming, yes, and then they don't show up. And the reason is, oh, we were too busy doing our homework, or oh, she just didn't want to. She was tired of being on the computer. So that's, that's a challenge. We want, another challenge is it's just not as confidential. We see adults walking in, say they're doing it from the kitchen on the computer because that's where the internet is best. And we see grandmas walking by or siblings walking in and out, and it's just not as secure and confidential a space. And then the whole internet connectivity issue, it's a huge challenge. And we've got kids in our city that are just not even doing school because they're still not connected, which is just, it's horrifying and devastating at the same time. And I'm sure you have that as well. How much time?
We made
a few more. Do we have a few more minutes to finish up?
Let's show them some projects for this, Talya. Why don't you do that?
Great, sure. So goal 2 is all about feelings, right? So we're moving away from goal and task 1, which is the cognitive understanding. So feelings, we've listed here, top 5 feelings we hear most from kids and teens, and we've added in the fear section really COVID specific fears. When we ask kids what are they most scared about, or if they're worried about their surviving parent, the answer is almost always yes after a parent has died. And we're seeing that really to a much heightened sense of fear now that COVID could potentially infect someone else from their family after they've already experienced a death. So to give you all a little more of the actual projects and takeaways, for our feelings section, we do feelings ball, which there's a feelings ball here, which many of you may have done before. Works a little bit different on Zoom, so that's not as accessible as some of our other ones, but in person, that one works really well. Ones that translate a little better to Zoom are feelings pie, where we've give in our box that we send to kids a feelings chart, and we ask them to pick 4 or 5 that they've felt most intensely in the last week or 2 weeks. You can give them any time frame that feels right to you and have them map on how much of that feeling they have felt in comparison to the others. And it allows for a visual representation of feelings, of course, and holding it up to the camera in Zoom actually works pretty well, we've seen. This works for middles and teens really well, feelings pie. And for youngers, we do something more like feelings soup for our littles, right? So how many sad carrots do you have, and draw that in? How many scared green beans, and draw that in? So again, seeing a map of feelings, but tailored to youngers. And this works on Zoom as well.
Oh,
so
that's
goal
all
3
there. Okay, all right.
Yeah, just for the sake of time, I didn't want to take up too much time there.
Question?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Someone is asking, for death by suicide, isn't it too much to ask of the child to draw a picture?
It's really not too much because they have those images in their mind, and if we're not asking them to share it with us, then they're going to be alone with that image. And we don't want them to be alone with it. If they're not ready to draw it, then what they'll do is, like for instance, a really good example that came to my mind with that question was, this was, I think it was a high schooler or middle schooler. They drew the room where their sibling or their grown-up went to a hotel to complete suicide. So they drew the hotel room, and they drew like a police tape marking off the room, making it like off limits, how they do that yellow police tape. And so they didn't actually show their person, the deceased dead on the bed like that, but they drew this room with the police tape like that. And I think they had like alcohol bottles on the floor in the room. So they represent it in a way that is manageable for them. Does that answer the question?
And to your,
I think so. Yeah, thank you.
So the idea is to provide support for them while the support is available, so that they're not spending years and years alone with it as a child and then ending up as an adult in their 30s, on a therapist's couch having suffered for years. Because that's the story we hear from all of our volunteers, that they spent all these years unsupported, alone, and in pain. And that the reason they volunteer with our agency and in other agencies around the country is because they don't want kids to have to do that anymore.
Thank you. The next question is, do you advise for the child to attend the funeral even if they're very young?
Yeah, as long as they have someone to companion them. So, because there's so much positive that goes on at the funeral. They get to hear, not necessarily the graveside part, but the part where people are sharing the stories and, there's music being played and a lot of love is being expressed and stuff. That part can be very, very uplifting. And kids, when they tell us their memories from that day, and they talk about how many people were there and people from their school were there, their faces just light up. So we know it's very, very supportive for the kids. But they need someone to companion them, if it's a parent that died, it shouldn't be the other parent. They need like someone else they really trust that can take them outside for a break to run around and eat and, play outside whenever they want to. They should not be expected to sit in a row like the adults are. Well, as far as the gravesite, watching the casket being lowered or something being shoved into the wall, for that part, unless the child wants to participate in the whole thing, if that part, I don't know that is like as supportive as the other part.
Makes sense. Thank you.
They should be nearby though, not left home alone with like some random person that's not one of their close caregivers.
How do you help a child who hasn't had the opportunity to say goodbye to a parent because their surviving parent decided for the child not to attend the viewing and or the funeral?
Well, that's a very common situation that we have. And, Talya, do you want to talk about how we do that at camp? Because it's like so common that they don't get to say goodbye or go to the funerals.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes the projects work just the same. Like Lauren mentioned, there's images in the children's heads either way. So we typically reframe that question to be, what do you imagine happened that day? What would you have wanted to say if you were present? Sort of talking through with them where their head is at in terms of what that experience is. And one of the powers, I think of our groups is that it is a very common experience to not be at the funeral memorial. And a lot of times our teens will connect over that, or even our middle schoolers about what that experience is like. So for us, it's not shying away from those questions. What happened from your perspective? Where were you when that was happening? Kind of just help them share the story from their point of view, and also to meet others what that's happened to can be powerful.
The favorite activity at our camp, though, is strange as this might sound, is our luminary ceremony. On the second night, the kids have made these lanterns that are decorated with pictures and words, and they get to put them in the pool and they say something out loud that they want their person to know, and imagining that person is going to hear it. And that's a chance for them to say goodbye, because most of them didn't get to say goodbye either before the death, at the deathbed, or at a funeral. And they really feel as though they're getting a chance to say their final goodbyes. And it's very healing, and everybody's crying. But they all say they're crying because they want to. Afterwards, when they do the evaluations, they always say it's their favorite thing, not swimming, not the DJ dance party, but they say the luminary ceremony, which tells us that they have this need to say goodbye because it was denied them.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Do you have any young students who imagine their deceased loved one is still physically there? They understand that their loved one has died, but pretend they are lying in their bed, you know, doing activities they used to see them doing.
They sense the presence of the person who died. That's a very common phenomena, that especially the younger kids in our littlest group will sense the presence and, you know, hear them in the house, that kind of thing. But to say that they are actually physically there is different than sensing the presence. I don't know that I hear anybody saying, no, they're really there. I don't mean like a ghost. I don't think that is something that I've heard after 26 years working with grieving kids. I'm not sure. Talya, are you interpreting that question in a different way?
The only other interpretation I have is I was supervising one of my MSW interns, and someone in her group felt very comforted. This was when they were still in person, felt very comforted feeling that their person who died was part of the group and part of the grief support group, and sort of was imagining that it was their companion during the group. And we explored, you know, what that was like and why that was comforting, and sort of a little bit of exploration there. But it wasn't that they were physically there, but it was comforting in their mind to think of their person as part of the grief support group.
Thank
you. And the research shows that grieving kids do talk regularly to the you know, the spirit or soul, whatever word you want to use, of their person who died. That's a very, very common and normal part of the grieving process, and how they maintain the bond with that person. And that's a positive and normal part of the grieving process.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Last question. How do you help alleviate children's fear of losing their surviving parent, especially when they say they are worried and want to spend more time with their surviving parent, but yet they isolate themselves and won't talk to their surviving parent?
Yeah.
Poor kid.
Well, it depends why they're isolating and not talking. If they're doing it because they don't want to overwhelm the surviving parent, that's a common dynamic in the first year, that they don't want to make that person cry or put too much of a burden on the adult, because the adult looks so bereaved during the first year. But the thing that we say to comfort them, that we've always said, is that, you know, even though it's no fair that, you know, your parent died so young, because most of them, if they're kids, the grown-up, the parent that died is relatively young in most of the cases. And it's no fair that they were so young when they died and all your friends still have a mom or have a dad. The truth is that most people live until they're very, very old. And we tell them what the, you know, according to the census is in Los Angeles, what the average age of death is, which has been about 81 years old. You know, we tell the kids that, and even the little ones, like I did for years, I did a group with 6 and 7-year-olds, and they would memorize that number. And then when a new kid would join the group and brought that up, they could tell them, I would say, can someone please tell, you know, this new person what the average age of death is in Los Angeles? And they'd be like, oh, well, it's 81 years old. And you could tell that they held on to that like a life preserver, and that they're comforted by the idea that most of the people that they know are going to live a long, long, long time. So it's highly unlikely that their other parent is going to die soon. So that's been very comforting. Now with COVID, that has changed that landscape quite a bit. So then we'll talk about what are some things you can do to keep yourself safe. And in parts of our city where there's a lot of deaths due to gang violence, you know, we have always talked about what are the things you have to do to keep yourself safe, you know, after school or on weekends.
Thank you. And I think that's all the time we have for questions today.